The Irving Park neighborhood was developed on land that once belonged to Amelia Eldridge. Eldridge decided to subdivide the area for housing plots in 1885. Development was in full force by 1889. The Eldridge estate was somewhat smaller than the other developments of the time. By creating somewhat smaller lots, Eldridge was trying to increase the number of plots that the development would yield, thus maximizing her return. To balance the impact of the smaller lots, she provided common land at Irving Park and Ladd Street to compensate as well as safeguard her investment. North and South Irving Park face this open strip of land. Tenants and property owners in this development were employed in professions such as steamfitters, mechanics, clerks, ironworkers, watchmen, and carpenters. Much like the overall neighborhood, this was not an area in which management lived, although some residents were skilled workers. Housing such as this was in demand to feed the local factories and workhouses. These properties fit the need well, providing quality housing on manageably sized lots in a garden setting with the amenities of Boston being comfortably close. 16 and 18 Royal Street, built in 1889 in the Victorian eclectic style, is known as the Moses Whiting House. Moses Whiting was the first owner of this house. He was a carpenter and builder and may very well have been involved in this construction. He owned this home until 1929. 22 and 24 Royal Street, built in 1894, is known as the Joseph D. Evans House. 26 Royal Street was built in 1897 and is known as the James H. Gilkey House. 32 Royal Street, built in 1888, is known as the Almeretta Critchett House. 38 and 40 Royal Street, built in 1890 in the Victorian eclectic style, is known as the Wallace W. Savage House. Purchased by Wallace W. Savage, who lived around the corner at 72 and 74 Riverside Street. Wallace was an owner of Pulsifer Savage & Co., commission merchants in produce with an office on Clinton Street in Boston. Savage was also active in the Methodist Church on Mount Auburn Street. 42 Royal Street, built in 1892, is known as the Ward M. Otis House. 43 and 45 Royal Street was built in 1889 and is known as the Jebediah Thomas Paine House. 14 North Irving Park, built in 1892, is known as the Henry O. Jacobs Rental House. 20 and 22 North Irving Park was built in 1888 and is known as the C.W. Claggett House. 9 South Irving Park, built in 1888 in the Queen Anne style, is known as the Allerton L. Shirtleff House. Only 2 families have lived in this house. The first had it built for his family. Mr. Shirtleff was a member of the Watertown Fire Department. 92 Irving Street, built in 1892, is known as the Catherine Kennedy House. 101 and 103 Irving Street, built in 1895 in the Colonial Revival style, is known as the Thomas Gavin House. A local developer, Thomas Gavin, built this house for the rental income it would produce. Gavin lived around the corner on North Beacon Street. Unfortunately, Gavin died soon after it was built in 1897, and his family maintained the house for rental purposes. Gavin is the quintessential immigrant story, a successful self-made man who worked to achieve the American dream. Gavin immigrated from Ireland, became a carpenter, and opened his own business. At the time of his death in 1897, he had amassed a small fortune and was buried at St. Patrick's Cemetery with a gravestone that rivaled the one erected for recently departed Father Stack, who was a beloved member of the community. The Gavin family owned this house until 1910. 109 and 111 Irving Street was built in 1889 and is known as the Herbert S. Wood House. 112 Irving Street, built in 1892, is known as the James O. Critchett House. 115 and 117 Irving Street, built in 1895 in the Queen Anne style, is known as the Thomas Lamont House. This house was built by Thomas Lamont, a local builder. He lived in it with his wife Alma for only a year or two. Lamont shows up in the Watertown directories beginning in 1889 as a carpenter living at 70 Mount Auburn Street at the corner of Summer Street. By 1897, he moved to Belmont Street in Belmont, and this was his last entry in the Watertown directories. It is likely that he built this house for a number of reasons, including income, a primary residence, and a way to market his business. Lamont sold the house to Chester Sprague in 1905. Sprague never lived in the house and conveyed it to James Nolan in 1906. 142 Irving Street, built in 1890 in the Queen Anne style, is known as the Albert L. Rumrill House. Eldridge sold this plot to Albert Rumrill, a woodworker, in an 1890 subdivision of the Fifield Street area. In the Watertown directories, Rumrill was initially identified as a woodworker and later as a pattern maker. It may be that Rumrill contributed to the construction of this house, as it has a number of higher-styled architectural elements, and as such would have advertised his skills and abilities to passers-by. Moreover, being a corner lot, Rumrill would have had two public facades with which to advertise himself. Rumrill died in March of 1926. 165 Irving Street, built in 1894, is known as the James Elliott House. 127 North Beacon Street was built in 1890 and is known as the Henry O. Jacobs House. 1 Ladd Street was built in 1894 and is known as the W. B. Weldon House. 11 and 13 Ladd Street, built in 1894, is known as the Patrick Vahe House. 29 and 31 Ladd Street, built in 1895, is known as the William H. Hubbard House. 30 and 32 Ladd Street, built in 1896, is known as the Frank J. Berry House. 63 to 65 Riverside Street, built in 1888, is known as the Jason W. Savage Double House. This area was originally a farm with present-day 77 Riverside Street as its main house. Savage was a farmer, and he had this house built upon his retirement. 64 to 66 Riverside Street, built in 1885, is known as the Frank J. Berry House. 72 and 74 Riverside Street, built in 1885 in the Victorian eclectic style, is known as the Wallace W. Savage House. Savage had the house built, and he lived here until about 1915. 82 Riverside Street, built in 1888 in the Victorian eclectic style, is known as the Stillman A. Pratt House. Most of the tenants and owners of this house were workers in the local area. Much like the overall neighborhood, this was not an area in which management lived, although some were skilled workers. 86 and 88 Riverside Street, built in 1886 in the Victorian eclectic style, is known as the Jebediah Thomas Paine House. Eldridge sold this and the plot next door at present-day 90 and 92 Riverside Street to J. Thomas Paine, who had duplicate houses built. Records indicate that Paine never lived here, but must have used the houses for rental income. Paine was born in Truro, Massachusetts in 1826 and was of Pilgrim stock. He was educated in Truro and there became a teacher, working on his father's farm during the non-academic year. He later learned the carpentry and joiner's trade and worked for 20 years in that business until he moved to Newton to become a superintendent of the Whipple Mills. He retired in 1883 and moved to Watertown and began a real estate business. He died in 1911. 90 and 92 Riverside Street, built in 1886, is known as the Jebediah Thomas Paine House. 111 and 113 Riverside Street, built in 1890 in the Victorian eclectic style, is known as the Joseph F. Ham House. One of the plots sold off to individual homesteaders was this property, sold to Joseph Ham. Ham built his house for rental income. Newspaper reports reveal that an automobile killed Ham as he crossed Massachusetts Avenue in Lexington in 1912. 114 Riverside Street, built in 1887, is known as the Helen E. Dadman House. 119 Riverside Street, built in 1888 in the Queen Anne style, is known as the Alton B. Cole House. It was designed by Chester Sprague. One of the plots that was sold off to individual homesteaders was this property. It was sold to Alton Cole, who used this property for rental income. Cole was listed as a proprietor of the Waltham Steam Laundry and as a molder. 120 Riverside Street, built in 1888, is known as the William H. Ellison House. 124 Riverside Street, built in 1889 in the Victorian eclectic style, is known as the Charles Towle House. The owner of this house, Charles Towle, from 1889 to 1917, was a wool puller. 129 to 131 Riverside Street, built in 1892, is known as the Hannah Sanger House. 132 Riverside Street, built in 1892 in the Colonial Revival style, is known as the William Perkins Double House. This plot was sold to Perkins, who owned the grist mill in Watertown Square under the name Perkins & Co., a hay, straw, and grain business. Perkins never lived here, but he used this property for rental income. 135 Riverside Street, built in 1888 in the Queen Anne style, is known as the Henry Eldridge House. It was designed by Chester Sprague. This house was sold to Eldridge by his mother, Amelia, a widow. The son, Henry, was a bookbinder in Boston.